and welcome back. I'm Bob von Bargen, President Emeritus of the Armed Forces Heritage Museum. Last week we learned about Neil Hartman and his experiences as a conscientious objector during the Second World War. Today we will hear from Warren Sawyer. Warren is now 100 years old and living in a local retirement community. Warren will provide you with an insight into the appalling treatment of mentally ill patients at the now demolished, infamous Byberry Hospital in Philadelphia, and his volunteering to participate in human medical experimentation. Let's join Warren as he relates how he became a Quaker.
It took me 5 years to make up my mind after extensive reading and studying the Quaker philosophy, going to all the conferences all over New York State with the head of New York yearly meeting, and I began to feel that this is the way to live, to conduct my life, and I joined the Quakers in 1937. That's after being introduced to them 5 years earlier. As far as being a CO, that was the major message to me from Quakerism, because it's diametrically opposed to what the Army has as a philosophy. And so I joined very happily.
The 30s roll away and it comes down to 1940 and the draft law comes into effect.
Yeah.
And you had to register for the draft.
Yeah.
What happened then?
Well, I registered for the draft and asked for a 4E classification.
What's a 4E?
4E classification is for CO, and that was in the law for Quakers or anybody that felt they didn't want to go into the Army. And I was drafted in February of 1942 and sent to North Carolina to build or to help build a national park and also to fight forest fires.
How did you get to Philadelphia?
In September of 1942, I went to Philadelphia State Hospital. I volunteered to go there. I heard about it in Buck Creek. They were starting the CO group at Philadelphia State Hospital, and so I volunteered. I felt that it was a lot more worthwhile.
Tell us about the hospital, the grounds, where it was, and what it looked like. And
the only, looking back on it, and even there, the only sign of what would one person think of as a hospital was in the infirmary where I started working on the night shift. It was the only place in the hospital that had sheets and pillows and pillowcases, because most of the patients in the infirmary, of course, were bedridden patients. But the rest of the hospital is a compliment to even think of it being as a person would think as a normal hospital. The degradation, the filth, the dirt, the treatment, all of those things were the lowest caliber. Paid attendants were violent in terms of treatment of patients to keep them in line. With 300 patients or more in the disturbed ward and the incontinent ward and the various wards. I had a TB ward also. It was just degradation throughout, and not much hope for any of the patients. They had very few ever saw a doctor, very few. I don't know the percentages, but it must be probably 97, 98% never saw a doctor.
how many doctors were on staff? Now this is a hospital for the mentally ill.
Yes. And in the good times, before we came, before the war, there were 83 doctors. And when we were there, we had 3 doctors who you didn't see very often. The shortage was very real. Nurses were few, but the patients who needed some kind of medical care were essentially taken care of by the nurses.
How many attendants were there, and what was the ratio between the attendants and the number of mentally ill patients?
We had 3 attendants, 3 COs during the day shift, whereas before the war they had 12 on the day shift. 300 incontinent patients who did not know how to take care of themselves in terms of their excrement, etc. And those 3 guys had all they could do. All we could do was custodial care. When you have 300 men in a room, incontinent, dirty, and all that sort of thing, and they were the lowest rung of the ladder. Repairs upon repairs of straps, cuffs and straps, when patients were padlocked, foot and by hands, in the bed.
What did the patients do during the day, and where did they stay?
Well, we had what they call a day room, about 75 feet long, about 25 feet high ceilings, no benches, no chairs, because the administration was afraid that patients having a violent attack would pick those benches or chairs up and beat some other patients.
Where did the patients sleep?
Well, they had beds in the dormitories in the basement and on the 2nd floor, and the beds were, well, the hospital was built for 3,000 patients, and we had 6,000, and they were still coming in. The Veterans Administration had their hospital filled, and so veterans were coming to Byberry too. But the dorms were crowded, double-decker beds, so close together to accommodate the overflow that you had to go between the beds sideways. You couldn't walk straight in. You had to go sideways to get in. It gives you an idea of how crowded the conditions were.
Conscientious objectors were subjected to testing, different types of testing. I remember once you mentioned frostbite and some of the other. Can you talk about that? The type of things that you encountered as a conscientious objector.
Yes. Dr. Neef, who was an Army doctor, was interested in jaundice, and he came up to Byberry to talk to and interview men who might be interested in volunteering for experiments, be a human guinea pig, in yellow jaundice. There were a lot of projects that we had opportunities to work in. Frostbite was one of them. That was in Boston. On hookworm, pneumonia, malaria. These were all different units around the country where fellows volunteered to be human guinea pigs in experiments and research. One of the other big, I think, important one was the starvation unit, which was in Minneapolis, researching how fast and the best way to bring back the refugees in Europe to mental health and physical health. And what came out of that, and these other projects, I don't know how successful they were.
There was a conscientious objector at Byberry. His name was Charlie Lord. Can you tell us something about him and his contribution?
Charlie Lord took pictures of patients and the conditions in various buildings in Byberry. It was a notorious hospital, as you can tell. He took all these pictures, and many of them appeared in a Life magazine in a feature article showing conscientious objectors at Byberry and of the patient's condition. And I had a lot of those pictures. I don't remember how I got them, but I gave them to Swarthmore Peace Library with my biography. And they were good pictures. They got good publicity in Life magazine.
Well, Warren, you know, I think your life is a testimonial to service to your fellow man, and your strength of conviction and integrity in following your religious beliefs mark you as a most exceptional man. And it's easy to see why, you can be very proud of your lifetime's accomplishments. Thank you. Any other thoughts, any other reminiscence that you have of the era?
I think that it's interesting that your first reason for going into Dijonus was my second reason for going into Dijonus. I went with the idea of getting rid of disease that was killing people. And then the second reason, which was your first, show that we're not afraid to give our lives if necessary.
You're in a very difficult situation given the times. 1941 was that environment does not exist today. There's a big difference in public attitude, and for you to stand for your convictions and do what you did took a lot of fortitude. You did not run away from the country. You did not turn your back on the nation. You stood for your religious convictions, and you took a lot of abuse. Yeah. You risked your life to prove your patriotism. And that's the story of two exceptional men who served the nation in what was called alternative service during the Second World War. I trust that it has given you an enriched view of conscientious objectors during the time of war. Our next lineup of serials will feature the charismatic Bob Yancey, a man who served with distinction over 3 wars and then went on to extraordinary achievements after his military service. So, see you next week when we usher in Black History Month with Bob Yancey's World War II experiences.